Now it's time for Lutz Niemann. I hope I pronounce your name properly. Lutz Niemann is a PhD student at Charles University in Czech Republic. And the title of his presentation is Boredom and the Life Body, Between Fullness and Emptiness. So Lutz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me here and letting me talk. So I'm very much at the beginning of my research into boredom, which means I'm super non-confident and I have fled into writing a text. So I'll be reading, and I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm really sorry for this. I regret this choice quite a lot, to be fair, but it is what it is. And yeah, I'll try to read in an engaging manner so as not to keep you bored. Okay. So, in my talk, I provide a reading of boredom as it occurs in the course of human lives and placed motion towards fulfillment. I first clarify the corporeal grounds of this motion before discussing its medial field, the fullness of the world, as I call it. Boredom is then to be addressed as a mood that affects everyday busyness. With Hans Rainer Sepp and Emmanuel Levinas, I explore desire as a fundamental force of existential motion, so of the motion of our human lives. Sepp points us towards non-sensical events that unfold in the depth of our corporeality, so of our embodied life. As lived bodies, we are bound to our bodies. So we live our bodies in an interior, have an ability over them, but we also cannot escape our bodies. We are anchored to them, and they are inescapable for us. There are fringes to our bodily self-identity. In many ways, the body we inhabit and which gives us our place and our here and now in reality holds an absolute limit. This function is called borderline body by Sepp. It's its massive fullness that individuates us and opens us to affection by what surrounds us. This affection is felt as a tension between the inner and resistance of otherness that affects it. This resistance is what Sepp denominates the real, and which we can feel, for example, when we run into a table. In this resistance, we feel that the table is definitely not me, doesn't let me through, for example. As pain illustrates, this resistance can be threatening, constricts us, and thus gives birth to desire, which seeks to avoid or control it and extend our inner, ourself. Therefore, desire directs life towards fullness through the non-resisting emptiness of space. And all lived bodies thus establish a basic mastery of and orientation in our surroundings, in reality. It becomes what Sepp calls a 0 point of orientation, following Husserl. However, desire often faces resistance. The other refuses assimilation to me. This resistance, in turn, for Sepp motivates the constitution of meaning or sense via understanding. Understanding he defines as the motion of a self in its infinite progression towards itself and all other. So understanding as meaning-mediated way of relating to something presupposes a distance or a difference. And for Sepp, we leave the fragility of our corporeal position and become at home in the world. So the total horizon of meaning we socially inhabit and recreate in our many acts of understanding. In this world, our identity is not primarily that of an able body, but that of an I. Centered in its body, the I experiences itself as the central locus of ability and experience. I can do things. I want to do this and that. This egoic identity is bound to others by emotional bonds, for example, shared possessions, values, which are all integrated into stories we tell each other, and we get, as Schaap calls it, entangled in. This net of stories extends our understanding and thus the outreach of our desire towards the fringes of time and space. Thus, the world has a protective function. It allows for a spatio-temporal domestication of the otherness that surrounds individuals. What does that mean? So diseases may be prevented by medicine and healthy lifestyles. And the depths of the past can be explored by myth or historical and natural sciences. This linguistically structured reality is, as Sepp says, our primary locus of existence. Correspondingly, our bodies are always also sense bodies, meaning-making and shaped by already existing meaning. In everyday life, we perceive the rain as rain and the mass of the body as my body, and not as some strange otherness that just constricts. Relative to our interpreting perception and reflection, the other appears as the fullness of the world, a meaningfully structured reality. Merleau-Ponty offers a rich philosophy to talk about our identity as a perceiving and perceived embodied individual in the fullness of the world. We can put focus, for example, on habits or the style of the world and our life in it. I'll get back to it later. The relative stability of the fullness of the world is the everyday locus for the search for fulfillment. Here, individual search for fulfillment is guided by socially informed interpretations of what fulfillment is and how it is to be achieved. And we can say that, especially in late modern societies, there is a certain specific restlessness that correlates to a constant production of excessive fullness, even though this restlessness of human life is not new, of course. In its lack of direction, it can have the feel of what Virilio calls polar inertia, aimless and seemingly static rustle and bustle. In digital capitalism and its corresponding culture of instantaneity, as Tomlinson calls it, desire is cultivated and its instant fulfillment promised. We are curators of ourselves, as Reckwitz calls it, both free to and charged with improving and updating ourselves, accumulating social capital in a tendency universal appropriation of what the fullness of the digital world offers us. Late modernity makes evident that human life in its search for fulfillment is always ahead of itself, as Heidegger famously calls it. We are rooted in the here and now by our corporeal nature, but we also exhibit a futurism, as Fink calls it. Our primary concern is with the near and far future to which we are directed in various modes. Work, debts that are due to be paid, promises made to friends, or even profiles in need of attention, and windows that have to be cleaned, they all orient our existential motion inside the basic trajectory of our projected life. Seemingly inevitably, one gets caught up in the rush. Life is filled, even overflowing. One feels carried, challenged, sometimes even crushed by its fullness. Is there any room for boredom in this? Again, a suspicion that is quite familiar from the history of thinking arises. With great busyness comes great boredom. Not only are many of the social practices we participate in, quote unquote, saturated with boredom, at work, total institutions, or while traveling, but also has our tendency to fill the gaps appearing in work and leisure time with small activities and entertainment, led some to assume that boredom is the grand negative against which late modernity braces itself. So Heidegger's analysis of boredom show how directed motion of existence is halted or frustrated in boredom. However, for Heidegger, boredom is a mood, and thus something that is neither fully on the subjective nor fully on the objective side of experiences. And crucially, something that reveals how Dasein, so his term for human life, finds itself in the world. So moods reveal our have the possibility to reveal to ourselves our factical situation in the world. The mood of boredom appears first with an aversive character. Its aversiveness makes it mandatory for any attempt at understanding it to scrutinize it in relation to its various modes of what he calls Zeitvertreib, passing or killing time that accompany it. He discusses, I think, as is probably well known, so I will just quickly do Heidegger. He discusses two superficial notions of boredom, being bored with and boring oneself with, which he takes to be grounded in a third type of boredom, deep boredom. It is boring. And they all exhibit different ways of Hingehaltensein, being held up, and Leergelassenheit, being left empty, modes in which time becomes an issue and things leave our desire empty and unfulfilled. They're also distinguished by the depth of emptiness and the stalling of any meaningful activity that they force upon Dasein, but also by the way that they again incite searches for activity and for occupation. So the first two types are relative to specific situations, so they are situational boredom, but in different ways. Yeah. The first type of boredom is relative to a specific situation and specific things that are encountered in the course of a temporally directed action. So we have a specific plan and we get held up by something in a specific situation that doesn't let us go away from it. So for example, a boring task that we have to do on the way to something more important. Heidegger's example here is waiting at a train station. Time moves hesitantly and appears empty. And the way of passing time is experienced as a fleeting unrest, seeking occupation in something. While this can work and we can flee into activities that fulfill or fill our attention, the things can, as Heidegger calls it, leave Dasein empty by leaving it alone, by not speaking to it. So again, the ways in which the things solicit activity by our meaningful interpretations of them are inhibited, but from the side of the things, seemingly. They're just too boring to do something with them. This boredom arises from the situation they appear in. So it's actually the situation we are in that makes the things appear super boring. His second example is an evening in a society where we pass time in a casual manner, which retrospectively appears to us as boring. But while we've been there, we didn't really feel bored. However, Heidegger then unearths in his attendance of the situation the small signs that he might have been bored all along, like drumming his fingers on the table and so on. What leaves empty in this situation is kind of indeterminate. I don't know what it is that was boring there. Heidegger then goes on to say that it has been the superficial enjoyment of an agreeable evening that has been boring itself, because the whole situation was basically designed to just pass time, to waste time. This situation, for Heidegger, this carefree evening, marks an extended carefree present in the passage of my individual story, of my individual time. This carefree evening, as Heidegger says, kind of encloses us in itself. We don't think about the past or the future. We just casually pass time. And by this, we get removed from temporal unity of ecstatic time, from temporal unity of past, present, and future. That is our authentic self. Deep boredom, in turn, is the most fundamental mood of Dasein, which is repressed by everyday occupation. Here, the emptying out of things that in the first type of boredom has been constricted to a specific situation, and the second type of boredom shows that the whole situation has been empty, and in the third type of boredom extends to the whole world, to all the things in the world. So Dasein faces a world which stops speaking to it, where the situation, where the things it is surrounded with cannot elicit its activity. This removes Dasein from its concrete inner worldly personality, which always holds itself by the way it occupies itself, by what it does, by who it talks to. It is indeterminate. Dasein falls also into an indifference, and it seemingly leaves no room for killing or passing time, and thus collects Dasein and confronts it with its own empty temporality. So very briefly, I think this is an important element in Heidegger's discussion of boredom. There's an orientation along the axis of horizontality and verticality. The mode of deep boredom affects a sinking that removes the affected from the horizontal relations they entertain in their occupation with things and their cohabitation with others. It pulls downwards towards what Heidegger would call the deeper self, or what we can call the deeper self. And for Heidegger, it presses Dasein towards the Augenblick, the moment of vision that prepares for resolute choice, for taking up one's own finite temporality and the possibilities inherent to it. Very briefly. However, with Levinas and Sepp, we can detect a specific mode of egocentric temporality in Heideggerian Dasein. How is this? For Heidegger, the individual temporality of Dasein is the horizon of appearing, the horizon that discloses the world in its totality. This horizon is delimited by being towards death. So it begins and ends with my own death. And this temporality is the temporal field inside of which Dasein relates to itself. So in order to live an authentic life, its primary preoccupation must be an authentic relation to its finite temporality, which secondarily entails relations to other people, things, and nature, even though I cannot authentically relate to my own temporality without other people, things, and nature. However, Heidegger ignores the fact that Dasein's finite temporality is materially grounded in its corporeality, which forces upon it a constant caring return to itself. With Levinas, we can hold that Dasein remains chained to itself inside the same. The same denotes the interior of my world, and thus the field inside which the other appears relative to my corporeal and social needs and understanding. Inside the totality of the same, a deep aversion to, quote-unquote, everything and everyone, but especially to oneself may arise. This aversion, just as the mode of deep boredom in Heidegger, does neither lie in specific objects nor a specific situation of one's life, but rather is directed towards being itself, as Levinas says. This aversion gains its aversive quality from the individual's frustrated desire to leave itself, in the course of which it constantly runs into the borders of its own world. It suffers from its existential loneliness. His notion of loneliness is a critique of the aforementioned solipsism, or natural egocentrism of Heideggerian Dasein. Dasein is loneliness insofar that others only appear out of the horizon delimited by its own temporality. Even if the lonely I resolutely decides to take hold of itself, it still remains inside itself. It cannot escape its own being, which arguably, Levinas, has been the source of its discontent. The I is bored of having to be itself, seeing only itself in the things and others it fails to engage with. Chained to itself, it exists a duality of boredom, quote unquote. What we find with Levinas is the importance of others and the corresponding linguistic generosity for the rupture of boredom and the fulfillment of life. Life can become stale if the individual encloses itself in its own world. As has often been noted, boredom and loneliness go hand in hand. With nobody to talk to, the fullness of the world loses its sharpness and weight. In loneliness, things may acquire a false transparency, we could maybe call it, if my understanding is not shared, confirmed, or challenged in dialogue. The world becomes boring when everything is transparent, quote unquote Svensson. For Levinas, it is only in encountering the absolutely other, so the other person, who, in their overflowing fullness, defy all my attempt at an assimilation or integration, that I am momentarily liberated from myself. For Levinas, it is towards the other where desire pulls me and from where meaning flows into my life. With Hans Rainer Sepp, we can understand boredom in a similar vein, so also from a kind of focus on alterity. However, with him, we can put more emphasis on the debodiment of experience and the correlative staleness of reality and desire that may accompany deep boredom, or that accompany deep boredom. For Sepp, being in the world entails an emancipation from the non-sensical bodily position of life. As noted, the world provides a creative distance not only to the presence of my own corporeal here and now, but also to all that is other. And it's precisely this distance that lets the other appear as structured reality. The tension between the non-sensical individuality, so unseparability, and the openness of the world is what Sepp calls the in-between. The in-between is a creative dynamic of meaningful life for Sepp. Life as the in-between maintains a tension between its non-sensical corporeal roots and its identity as an individual, so a person in the world. Thus, it maintains a lively tension between the many shapes and forms in which the fullness of the world appears to me, and the absolute borders to the fullness of the world that are experienced as the real. As noted, the real can be a threatening and aversive experience that bodily life desires to avoid, and this leads to the enclosure in the world. This, according to Sepp, denotes an intensification of mediality. And now I have some hypotheses on deep boredom, which are not fully worked out, and I'll be quick. Deep boredom may arise due to excesses of this tendency of enclosing. Here, the fullness of the world progressively appears as devoid of strangeness and a dimension of withdrawal. As Dorfman highlights with Merleau-Ponty, this dimension of withdrawal is what carries the continuous solicitation of our lived bodies by their structured environments. No perception, no apprehension of a thing discloses it in its fullness, but they all remain perspectival, limited, and thus open for new perceptions and surprises. And while habits and repetitions or customs that structure perception are important in facilitating our goal-oriented movement, their repetitive element may be a source of a flattening or emptying of the appearing things. Again, this flattening is both functional. For example, if I constantly have to think about how walking works, I couldn't think while walking or couldn't do anything else. Yeah? But also this flattening seems to be at work in the deflation of the pleasure derived from certain pleasurable activities, for example. Also, yeah, I think pretty clear. Further, the in-between maintains a lived tension of our corporeal present and the futurism of understanding. With that, one could explore how meaning carries understanding away from its corporeal present. So, for example, when I live in light of an ideal self, I move toward this self and sometimes may sacrifice certain bodily needs in order to get there. Yeah? And this difference between, for example, our ideal self, but also demands and goals, social norms we have to live up, or even commercial manipulations that incite superfluous desires, and our bodily presence, is the place of both our control over our lives and us being pulled into a restless motion in which things and pleasures receive a more and more fleeting nature. And I think this focus on the body to kind of get out of this temporalization, for example, of our experience, or this kind of understanding itself more and more cognitively and more medially. The role of the body in this is, for example, exhibited by practices like yoga or meditation and so on that are kind of famous because they focus on the body to get our understanding, our thinking back to earth in a certain sense. And and I think that's kind of it. So I think this can maybe help in understanding how deep boredom can arise from oversaturation in certain elements. Because with Sepp, we can think the collapse of meaning that accompanies deep boredom could be related to the lack of challenges to meaning making by the real, for example, but also maybe to a sense of wonder, to a sense of something we don't understand, and an estrangement from one's corporeal present. So maybe a lack of corporeal depth correlates to a sinking into emptiness. And what Sepp and Levinas may show us is that desire is sparked and renewed by that which it cannot immediately reach, or which even makes it impossible to fully have it. As Svensson says, nothing is more boring than the boundless. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Lutz. Thank you so very much. It has been reading a lot about Heidegger's thesis on boredom, but just to listen to a reflection on them always make me think a lot, because I struggle with his thesis. I disagree with many points. So we have maybe time for a very quick question. So anybody? Annie wrote in the chat, Lutz, can you type the names of the thinkers you are referencing in your talk into the chat other than Heidegger, obviously, because she's not familiar with them and wonder how to spell their names.
Yeah, of course, I can do that. That's no problem. I can quickly do it.
Okay, if there is any question right now, maybe we can move to the next presentation. If we can discuss if something arises in your mind later. Okay, if you agree, Lutz?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, perfect.